There is a room inside the human mind that no one speaks of. It has no windows, no doors that open easily. The walls are neither dark nor light. They exist in a grey that seems to absorb all colour, all sound, all sensation. In this room, you can scream and hear nothing. You can reach out and touch nothing. You can weep and feel nothing. This room has a name. We call it emotional numbness. But before we name it, before we diagnose it, before we attempt to escape it, we must first understand a fundamental truth about the human condition. That sometimes the most profound protection the mind can offer is the complete absence of feeling. That sometimes, in the mathematics of survival, zero is the only equation that makes sense. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the center of a vast ocean. The water stretches endlessly in all directions, dark, deep, and utterly still. There are no waves, no wind, no sound except the beating of your own heart. You expect to feel the cold of the water, the salt on your skin, the fear of drowning. But you feel nothing. The ocean passes through you as if you were made of the same substance as the water itself. You are there, but you are not there. Present, but absent. Alive, but not living. This is not depression, though depression may live here. This is not trauma, though trauma built these walls. This is something more primordial, more fundamental to the architecture of consciousness itself. It is the mind's last defense mechanism, the final fortress when all other castles have fallen. Emotional numbness is the ghost that haunts modern consciousness. It is the epidemic that wears no visible symptoms. It is the silent scream of a generation that has seen too much, felt too much, been asked to bear too much, until feeling itself became unbearable. We live in an age of contradictions. We are more connected than ever before, yet more isolated. We have more information than any generation in human history, yet less wisdom. We have more ways to express emotion, emojis, reactions, digital affirmations, yet we feel less. We have therapists and medications and mindfulness apps and self-help books, and still, millions of people walk through their lives as if they are watching themselves from behind glass. They go through the motions. They smile at the appropriate times. They say, "I'm fine," when asked how they are. They perform the choreography of a feeling life while feeling nothing at all. But here is the question that will guide our journey tonight. What if emotional numbness is not the enemy? What if it is a message? What if the absence of feeling is itself the most important feeling we could pay attention to? Tonight, we will descend together into the silent void. We will trace the origins of this peculiar form of psychological disappearance. We will meet the scientists and philosophers who first mapped this territory. We will explore the neuroscience of why the brain chooses silence over sensation. We will confront the cultural forces that have made numbness not just common, but almost inevitable. And then, if we have the courage, we will discuss the awakening, the return to feeling, the resurrection of the emotional self that was buried alive. This is not a story about illness. This is a story about the human mind's most sophisticated survival mechanism, and what happens when survival becomes its own form of death. This is a story about what it means to be human in an age that demands we feel everything and nothing simultaneously. This is a story about the space between presence and absence, between being and non-being, between the person you remember being and the stranger you've become. The ancient Greeks had a word for this state, apatheia, but they did not mean it as pathology. They meant it as wisdom, the ability to remain untouched by the chaos of passion. The Stoics cultivated it as virtue. The Buddhists sought it as enlightenment. But somewhere between ancient wisdom and modern life, something changed. The voluntary detachment of the philosopher became the involuntary disconnection of the traumatized. The chosen tranquility of the sage became the forced silence of the wounded. And now we find ourselves in a strange moment in human history where millions of people would give anything to feel something, anything real. So let me ask you directly, because this journey requires honesty. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever looked at something beautiful and felt nothing? Have you ever received good news and your heart remained still? Have you ever been with people you love and felt like you were watching the scene through a camera lens, distant and detached? Have you ever wondered where the person you used to be has gone and whether they will ever return? If you have, you are not alone. You are not broken. You are not beyond repair. You are simply in the room with no windows. And this is the story of how you got there, why you stayed, and how, when you are ready, you might find your way back to the world of feeling. But I warn you, this journey will not be easy. To understand emotional numbness, we must understand pain. To understand disconnection, we must understand what connection costs. To understand the absence of emotion, we must revisit the emotions that were too overwhelming to bear. We must go back to the beginning. Every exploration of the mind begins with a cartographer, someone brave or foolish enough to venture into uncharted territories and return with a map. In the case of emotional numbness, our first guide is a man who spent his entire life studying what it means to be human when humanity itself seems to vanish. Vienna, 1895. Sigmund Freud sits in his study, listening to a woman describe an experience that will change psychology forever. She speaks clearly, rationally, methodically, describing horrors that should reduce any human to tears. Sexual trauma, childhood abuse, violence that should scar the soul. But as she speaks, her voice never wavers. Her face shows no emotion. She recounts her suffering as one might describe the weather or read from a grocery list. Freud recognizes something profound in this moment. The woman is not healed. She is not recovered. She has not transcended her trauma through wisdom or therapy. She has simply vanished from her own story. She speaks of herself as if speaking of someone else entirely. Her memories are intact, but the emotional charge that should accompany them has been disconnected, severed, amputated from consciousness. Freud called this dissociation, the mind's ability to separate experience from emotion, memory from feeling, trauma from self. It was, he realized, both brilliant and terrible. A defense mechanism so powerful that it could allow someone to survive the unsurvivable, but at the cost of becoming a stranger to themselves. But Freud was not the first to notice this strange country of the mind. We must go further back, further into history, further into the moment when human beings first realized that the heart could go silent while the body still breathed. Ancient Egypt. The physicians of the pharaohs kept detailed medical papyri documenting all manner of human ailments. Among them, they described a condition they called the emptying of the heart. People who had suffered great tragedy, the loss of children, the destruction of their homes, the horrors of war, would sometimes enter a state they called ka. The soul, they believed, could leave the body while the person still lived. Not death, but something adjacent to it, a living death, a walking absence. The treatment was not medicine, it was ritual, music, dance, sensory overwhelming designed to shock the soul back into the body. They understood something we are only now rediscovering, that emotional numbness is not a cognitive problem. It is an embodied one. The thinking mind cannot think its way back to feeling. The body must be awakened. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates described what he called melancholia, but not the sadness we associate with depression. He described patients who felt nothing at all, no sadness, no joy, no fear, no desire, as if the vital force that animated human beings had simply stopped. He believed it was caused by an excess of black bile, a physiological explanation for a psychological phenomenon. He was wrong about the biology, but he was right about the instinct, that emotional numbness has physical roots, that it manifests in the body, that it can be seen and measured and understood through the lens of natural science. The Middle Ages brought a different interpretation. The Catholic Church called this state acedia, a spiritual torpor, a disconnection from God, a dangerous sin of sloth disguised as peace. Monks who spent too long in isolation sometimes fell into this state. They called it the noonday demon, a peculiar emptiness that descended when the sun was highest, when they should feel most alive. Instead, they felt nothing. No religious ecstasy, no divine connection, just silence. The Church's solution was harsher discipline, more prayer, more suffering, as if emotional numbness could be beaten out of the soul like a demon. They did not understand that it was not the absence of God they were feeling. It was the absence of self. But our story truly begins in earnest in the 19th century, when psychology was born and human consciousness became something that could be studied, measured, dissected, and understood. Enter Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who would become Freud's most brilliant student and eventually his most profound challenger. Jung encountered patients who described a peculiar phenomenon. They would wake up one day and realize they felt nothing, not just sadness or depression, but a complete flattening of all emotional experience. Joy was gone, sorrow was gone, love was gone, fear was gone. They existed in a grey realm where nothing mattered because nothing could be felt. Jung recognized this as something different from depression. Depression, he argued, was still an emotion, a powerful, overwhelming emotion of despair and hopelessness. But this was the absence of emotion, the void where emotion should be. He called it the death of the soul while the body continues to function. Jung believed that emotional numbness represented a crisis of the psyche, specifically a crisis of integration. The conscious mind and the unconscious mind had become so separated that feeling could no longer flow between them. The bridge was broken, the connection was severed. In his framework of archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung saw emotional numbness as a kind of psychological death that preceded rebirth. The patient had to die to their old self, to dissolve completely, before a new, more integrated self could emerge. But the danger was that some people got stuck in the death phase. They died, but never resurrected. They became living ghosts, haunting their own lives. His solution was individuation, the painful process of reintegrating the fragmented parts of the self, of making conscious what had been unconscious, of facing the shadow aspects of the personality that trauma had forced into hiding. But Jung worked primarily with wealthy European patients who had the luxury of deep, expensive, long-term psychoanalysis. What about everyone else? What about the millions of people throughout history who experienced this numbness and had no name for it, no treatment, no understanding? The 20th century would bring new horrors that would produce emotional numbness on an unprecedented scale. World War I, the trenches, shell shock. Soldiers returned from the front lines describing a disturbing phenomenon. They could not cry. They could not feel fear. They could not feel joy at being reunited with loved ones. They moved through their lives like automatons, mechanically performing the tasks of living without any emotional experience of life itself. The military called it cowardice at first, then neurosis, then shell shock. Eventually we would call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But the emotional numbness that accompanied it was its own distinct phenomenon. Psychiatrists noticed something fascinating. The numbing would often come after an initial period of hypervigilance and intense emotion. The body and mind would become so overwhelmed by fear, so flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, so constantly activated by the threat of death, that eventually, like a circuit breaker flipping, everything would just shut down. The emotions didn't disappear. They went underground. They became encapsulated, locked away in some deep vault of the psyche where they could no longer interfere with survival. But here is what the early trauma researchers discovered. The emotions were still there, still active, still consuming energy and attention, just beneath conscious awareness. Emotional numbness wasn't the absence of emotion. It was emotion under anesthesia. The pain was still there. You just couldn't feel it anymore. This insight would prove revolutionary. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers studying Holocaust survivors noticed the same pattern. Survivors who had endured unspeakable trauma often described feeling dead inside. They went through the motions of rebuilding their lives, but there was no emotional color to their experience. Food had no taste, music had no beauty, love had no warmth. One survivor, interviewed decades after liberation, said something haunting. "I survived the camps, but part of me died there, the part that feels. I saved my life, but I lost my soul." Now we must turn to the science, to the brain itself, to understand not just the psychology of emotional numbness, but its neurobiology. The human brain is not a single organ. It is a collection of systems that evolved at different times, for different purposes, that somehow work together to create the experience we call consciousness. At the most primitive level, we have the brainstem, the reptilian core that controls basic survival functions: heart rate, breathing, fight or flight. Above that, the limbic system, the mammalian brain that processes emotion, memory, attachment, the amygdala, which screams danger, the hippocampus, which stores traumatic memory, the anterior cingulate cortex, which registers emotional pain as intensely as physical pain, and at the top, the prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of the brain, the seat of reason, planning, self-control, executive function. When trauma occurs, something fascinating happens in this tri-level brain. The amygdala, the alarm system, goes into overdrive. It screams danger constantly, flooding the system with stress hormones. The hippocampus tries to contextualize and store the memories. But if the trauma is severe enough, if it's chronic enough, if it overwhelms the system completely, the prefrontal cortex does something drastic. It shuts down the connection to the limbic system. Neuroscientists using fMRI scans have actually watched this happen in real time. When trauma survivors are shown images or told stories related to their trauma, their amygdala lights up, showing intense emotional activation. But simultaneously, their prefrontal cortex suppresses activity in the areas that allow emotional information to reach conscious awareness. The emotions are firing, the brain is screaming. But the message never reaches consciousness. The person reports feeling nothing. This is not a metaphor. This is literal neurobiology. Emotional numbness has a measurable, observable, physical basis in brain activity. But here's what makes it even more fascinating. Over time, with chronic suppression, the actual neural pathways between the limbic system and prefrontal cortex begin to atrophy. Use it or lose it. The connections literally weaken. Emotional numbness becomes not just a temporary defense, but a rewiring of the brain itself. Which raises the crucial question. If the brain has physically changed, if the pathways have weakened, if the connections have been severed, can they be restored? Can someone who has lost the ability to feel learn to feel again? This question will haunt us through the rest of our journey. But before we descend into the darkness of how numbness takes hold, we must understand one more piece of the puzzle, one more origin point that is uniquely modern, uniquely contemporary, uniquely relevant to this moment in human history. We must talk about the society that produces emotional numbness by design. The 21st century has given birth to a strange new form of collective dissociation. We are more stimulated than any humans in history. Thousands of notifications, constant information, perpetual entertainment, endless scrolling. But this oversaturation produces its own form of numbness. Psychologists call it compassion fatigue or psychic numbing. When confronted with too much suffering, too many news stories of war, famine, climate disaster, political chaos, the mind simply cannot maintain emotional engagement. It shuts down, not as pathology, but as adaptive response to impossible demands. You cannot care deeply about everything. You cannot grieve every tragedy. You cannot feel outrage at every injustice. The emotional bandwidth of a single human nervous system is finite. When the demands exceed the capacity, numbness is not failure, it is mathematics. Add to this the commodification of emotion itself. We are asked to perform feelings constantly on social media, to curate our emotional lives for public consumption, to react, respond, engage, signal our feelings in ways that can be measured, liked, shared, monetized. But performance of emotion is not experience of emotion. In fact, the constant performance may actually interfere with genuine feeling. We become so skilled at showing emotion that we forget how to feel it. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard wrote about the simulation replacing the real. We have become so immersed in simulated experiences, movies, games, virtual worlds, social media personas, that direct, unmediated emotional experience becomes increasingly rare. We feel more about fictional characters than about our neighbors. We cry at movies but remain dry-eyed at funerals. This is not moral failure. This is the inevitable consequence of living in a civilization that has divorced experience from meaning, sensation from emotion, image from reality. And so we arrive at the present moment, where emotional numbness is not an individual pathology, but a cultural condition, where entire generations describe feeling empty, disconnected, going through the motions, where therapy apps and medication and wellness culture attempt to treat symptoms of a problem that may be civilizational in scope. We have traced the origins. From ancient civilizations recognizing the emptying of the heart, to Freud discovering dissociation, to Jung mapping the death of the soul, to modern neuroscience revealing the physical mechanisms, to contemporary society mass-producing the conditions for collective numbing. Now we must descend deeper. We must enter the void itself. There is a moment, precise and unmistakable, when emotional numbness begins. For some, it is sudden, like a switch being flipped. For others, it is gradual, like color slowly draining from a photograph until only gray remains. But there is always a moment when the person realizes something has changed. Something fundamental has shifted in their relationship to their own inner life. Let me tell you a story. A woman, we'll call her Sarah, though she could be anyone, wakes up one morning after months of accumulating stress, work pressure, relationship problems, family illness, financial strain. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would qualify as capital T trauma. Just the grinding, relentless weight of modern life. She goes through her morning routine, coffee, shower, checking her phone. But something is different. The coffee tastes like nothing. The hot water on her skin registers as sensation, but not as experience. She looks at her phone and sees messages from friends, news headlines, photos designed to evoke emotion, and feels nothing. At first she thinks she's just tired, but the days continue, then weeks. She functions perfectly, goes to work, has conversations, laughs at jokes, because that's what you're supposed to do. But inside, nothing. She is performing the role of herself, while the actual self has vacated the premises. She describes it later, after therapy, after understanding, like this. It was like I was piloting a meat robot. I could make the body do things, say things, respond appropriately, but I wasn't there. I was watching from somewhere very far away, through a telescope, seeing this person who looked like me but wasn't me, going through the motions of a life I no longer felt I was living. This is how it begins for millions of people. Not with dramatic trauma, not with a single catastrophic event, but with accumulation, with too much for too long, with a nervous system stretched beyond its capacity to process, integrate, and recover. The mind makes a calculation, unconscious but precise. If I keep feeling at this intensity, I will break. So I will stop feeling instead. But to truly understand this descent, we must go deeper into the mechanics, into the exact process by which a feeling human being becomes emotionally absent. The process begins with overwhelm. The human nervous system evolved for a very different world than the one we inhabit. Our stress response, the famous fight or flight mechanism, was designed for acute, time-limited threats. A predator appears. Adrenaline floods the system. You fight or flee. The danger passes. The system returns to baseline. But modern life presents a different challenge. Chronic, unrelenting activation without resolution. Financial stress doesn't have a resolution. It's ongoing. Work pressure doesn't end. It accumulates. Relationship conflict doesn't resolve quickly. It persists. Existential anxiety about the future, climate change, political instability, technological disruption has no resolution at all. The nervous system stays activated, cortisol levels remain elevated, the amygdala keeps firing, and the body, brilliant in its adaptation, eventually says, "We cannot sustain this. We must protect ourselves." Enter the first stage of emotional numbing, suppression. At first it's voluntary. You consciously push down difficult emotions because you need to get through the day. You can't afford to fall apart at work. You can't process grief while also taking care of children. You can't let anxiety paralyze you when there are bills to pay. So you push it down. You compartmentalize. You tell yourself, "I'll deal with this later." But there is no later. Later never comes. The emotions accumulate in the basement of consciousness, piling up like unpaid debts, gathering interest, growing larger and more unwieldy. And then something shifts. The suppression that was once voluntary becomes involuntary. You try to feel and can't. The pathway has closed. The door has locked. What began as a coping mechanism has become a prison. Psychologists call this alexithymia, literally no words for feelings. The inability to identify and describe emotions. People with alexithymia know something is happening internally, but they cannot name it, cannot access it, cannot express it. The emotional vocabulary has been erased. One man described it like this: "Someone asked me how I was feeling, and I opened my mouth to answer, and I realized I didn't know. Not that I didn't want to tell them. I literally did not know what I was feeling. It was like trying to see in a room with no light. I knew something was there, but I couldn't make out its shape." But emotional numbness is not uniform. It does not affect all emotions equally. And this is where it becomes particularly insidious. Research shows that emotional numbing tends to follow a specific pattern. Positive emotions disappear first. Joy, pleasure, excitement, anticipation, love. These are the first casualties. You stop looking forward to things you used to love. Music loses its power to move you. Food loses its flavor. Sex loses its intensity. The activities that once brought you alive now feel empty, meaningless, hollow. Why do positive emotions go first? Because they require vulnerability. They require opening yourself to experience. And when the system is in defensive mode, vulnerability is the enemy. Better to feel nothing than to risk feeling good and having it taken away. This creates a terrible trap. The person becomes isolated not just from others, but from the possibility of pleasure itself. They stop seeking joy because seeking it feels pointless. They stop connecting because connection doesn't register as rewarding. They withdraw into the grey lands, into the safety of not feeling. But here's the cruel irony. The negative emotions don't disappear. They go underground. Anxiety continues to hum beneath conscious awareness, a baseline tension that never fully resolves. Anger gets compressed into irritability and passive aggression. Sadness becomes a low-grade aching that has no clear source. Shame operates like a constant background noise, just below the threshold of consciousness. You feel nothing, except the vague, persistent sense that something is wrong, that you are wrong, that you are broken in some fundamental way. And because you cannot access your emotions clearly enough to process them, they express themselves somatically, through the body. This is where we must talk about the body keeps the score, a concept popularized by psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, but understood intuitively by trauma therapists for decades. When emotions cannot be felt consciously, they manifest physically. Chronic pain, digestive issues, headaches, muscle tension, fatigue, autoimmune conditions. The body becomes the voice for emotions that have no other outlet. One woman described having severe back pain for years, multiple doctors, physical therapy, pain medication. Nothing helped, until she began trauma therapy and started recovering access to her emotions. Within months, the back pain disappeared. It hadn't been structural. It had been emotional. Grief and rage literally held in her body because her mind could not hold them consciously. The body never lies. The body never numbs. It keeps screaming the truth that consciousness has refused to hear. But let us descend even deeper, into the existential dimension of emotional numbness, into what it does to identity, to meaning, to the sense of self. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about Das Man, the they-self, the inauthentic self that conforms to social expectations, that performs the role society assigns, that has no direct encounter with its own being. This is not dissociation in the clinical sense, but it is a form of existential numbness, going through life asleep, automated, never fully present. Emotional numbness takes this to an extreme. You become not just inauthentic, but absent. The question is no longer, who am I, but am I? This produces a peculiar form of suffering that is almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Because how do you explain the pain of not feeling? How do you say, I'm suffering, when you can't feel suffering? How do you cry for help when you can't cry at all? The existentialists called this kind of suffering angst, not anxiety in the clinical sense, but a fundamental disquiet about existence itself. The numbness creates a distance between the self and world that cannot be bridged through normal means. You are in life, but not of it. Present, but not participating. Søren Kierkegaard described it as the sickness unto death. Not physical death, but the death of the self while still living. He wrote, "The torment of despair is precisely this, not to be able to die. It has much in common with the situation of the moribund when he lies and struggles with death and cannot die. So to be sick unto death is not to be able to die, yet not as though there were hope of life. No, the hopelessness in this case is that even the last hope, death, is not available. This is the existential heart of emotional numbness. You cannot die and you cannot live. You are trapped in between, a ghost in your own life. And now we must confront the role of shame in perpetuating emotional numbness. Shame is the emotion about emotions. It is the voice that says, your feelings are wrong, your pain is weakness, your vulnerability is pathetic, your needs are too much, you are too much. When shame attaches to emotional expression, people learn to hide their feelings, first from others, then eventually from themselves. The child who is told, stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about, learns that emotional expression is dangerous. The teenager mocked for being too sensitive learns to suppress vulnerability. The adult told to get over it or move on learns that their grief is a burden to others. Over time, shame creates a complete disconnection from emotional life. Better to feel nothing than to feel something and be humiliated for it. Better to be numb than to be shamed for being human. Researcher Brené Brown has documented how shame operates as a mechanism of social control, particularly around gender. Men are shamed for showing vulnerability, sadness, fear. They learn that emotional expression equals weakness. The phrase "man up" is literally a command to disconnect from feelings. Women are shamed for showing anger, for having needs, for taking up space. They learn to smile through pain, to prioritize others' feelings over their own, to make themselves smaller emotionally as well as physically. The result is a culture where emotional authenticity is punished and emotional performance is rewarded, where everyone is secretly numb but pretending to feel, where genuine emotional connection becomes increasingly rare because no one is willing to risk the vulnerability required to access and share genuine emotion. And so the numbness spreads, from individual to family to community to culture, until we arrive at this moment where therapists report that the most common presenting complaint is not depression or anxiety, but "I don't feel anything anymore." Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in contemporary life. You are scrolling through social media. You see a post about a tragedy, a school shooting, a natural disaster, a refugee crisis. Your brain registers it. But you feel nothing, not because you're a bad person, not because you don't care, but because your system is overloaded. This is the 20th tragedy you've seen this week. Your capacity for emotional response has been exhausted. So you keep scrolling. You see a friend's post about their achievement, a new job, a graduation, a beautiful photo. You reflexively click the like button. You might even comment, "Congrats?" But you don't actually feel happy for them. You don't feel anything. You're performing social norms while emotionally vacant. You put down your phone. Your partner asks you how you're doing. You say fine. They can sense something is off. They probe. You try to access your internal state and nothing. You don't know how you're feeling. You're not sad. You're not happy. You're not anxious. You're not calm. You're just there, existing without experiencing. This becomes your normal. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. You forget what it felt like to be emotionally alive. You start to wonder if you ever really felt things, or if you just imagined you did. Memory becomes unreliable. Were you ever really happy? Did you ever really love? Or were you always just pretending, and only now admitting the truth? This is the deepest level of the descent. Not just emotional numbness, but doubt about whether emotions were ever real to begin with. The retroactive rewriting of personal history through the lens of current disconnection. And this brings us to perhaps the darkest aspect of emotional numbness, the secondary isolation it creates. When you can't feel, you can't connect. Emotional connection requires emotional availability. It requires the ability to recognize emotions in yourself and respond to emotions in others. It requires empathy, which is not just cognitive understanding, but emotional resonance. But when you're numb, other people's emotions become incomprehensible. They seem excessive, irrational. You watch someone crying and think, why are they reacting so strongly? You see someone excited and think, what's the point? You observe love and romance and connection, and it seems like theater, like pretending, like some elaborate game everyone agrees to play, but you can no longer remember the rules to. This creates a feedback loop. Your numbness makes you seem cold, distant, unavailable. People pull away. You become more isolated. The isolation reinforces the numbness, and so it spirals. Some people in this state become bitter, interpreting their numbness as enlightenment. I've seen through the illusion of emotion. Everyone else is just caught up in drama and irrationality. I'm the only one who sees clearly. This is the numbness defending itself, rationalizing its existence as wisdom rather than wound. Others become desperate, seeking increasingly extreme experiences to feel something. Dangerous behaviors, intense substances, dramatic relationships, anything to break through the grey. But the experiences register and fade, leaving no lasting impression. Like pouring water into a colander. The sensations pass through without being held, and some people simply accept the numbness as permanent. They redesign their lives around it. They choose careers that don't require emotional engagement. They avoid relationships that demand vulnerability. They construct a perfectly functional life that has no depth, no color, no aliveness. They survive, but they do not live. This is the bottom of the descent. The grey lands in their full desolation, the void at the center of contemporary existence. But here, right here, in the deepest darkness, something begins to shift. Because there is a paradox at the heart of emotional numbness. You cannot know you are numb unless some part of you is still capable of feeling. The very awareness that something is wrong, that something is missing, that you are not fully alive, this awareness itself is a form of feeling. The desire to feel again, even if it feels distant and theoretical, means that the capacity for desire still exists. The longing for connection, even through the fog of disconnection, means that the knowledge of connection has not been entirely erased. This is the crack in the facade, the first ray of light, the beginning of what we might call awakening. There is a story in Greek mythology that perfectly captures the journey back to emotional life. Orpheus, the greatest musician who ever lived, loses his wife Eurydice to a serpent's bite. She dies and descends to the underworld. But Orpheus cannot accept her death, so he does something no living person has done. He descends into Hades itself, into the land of the dead, to bring her back. His music is so beautiful that even the gods of death weep. They agree to let Eurydice return on one condition. Orpheus must walk ahead, and he cannot look back at her until they have both emerged into the sunlight. If he looks back while still in the underworld, she will be lost forever. They begin the ascent. Orpheus leads. Eurydice follows. But as they near the exit, as the sunlight becomes visible, Orpheus is seized by doubt. Is she really there? Has he been tricked? In a moment of fear and doubt, he looks back, and Eurydice vanishes forever. This is the archetypal story of emotional awakening. The journey back to feeling is an ascent from the underworld. It requires faith without confirmation. It requires moving forward without the certainty that what you're seeking will be there when you arrive. And the greatest danger is turning back, looking back, doubting the process before it's complete. But unlike Orpheus, you are not trying to resurrect someone else. You are trying to resurrect yourself. The awakening from emotional numbness does not happen all at once. It is not a single moment of revelation where suddenly all feeling returns in a flood of technicolor emotion. That's the Hollywood version. The reality is subtler, stranger, and more difficult. It begins with recognition. Someone, maybe a therapist, maybe a friend, maybe something you read or a video you watch, names what you're experiencing. They say the words emotional numbness or dissociation or disconnection, and something clicks. There is a name for this. You are not crazy. You are not uniquely broken. This is a thing that happens to people. This is a thing that has happened to you. This recognition alone can be profound, because what cannot be named cannot be changed. Bringing the numbness into conscious awareness is the first step toward transformation. But here's what makes it difficult. Recognizing you're numb means you must confront why you're numb. And the why almost always involves pain, trauma, loss, overwhelm, the emotions that were too much to feel in the first place. The numbness was protection. And now you're being asked to remove the protection and face what it was protecting you from. This is terrifying. Many people turn back at exactly this point. They recognize they're numb. They glimpse what lies beneath the numbness, and they decide, consciously or unconsciously, that the numbness is preferable. Better to feel nothing than to feel that, and they're not wrong. The pain beneath the numbness is real. It is intense. It is legitimate. The question is not whether the pain exists, but whether staying numb is worse than feeling the pain. For those who choose to continue, who commit to the journey back to feeling, the path follows several stages. These are not linear. People move between them, circle back, spiral upward through iterations. But understanding the terrain helps navigate it. The first stage is thawing. Imagine emotional numbness as a kind of freezing. The emotions are still there, but they're locked in ice. Thawing is the slow, uncomfortable process of allowing the ice to melt. In therapeutic terms, this often involves gradually building capacity to tolerate emotional experience. You don't dive into the deepest trauma immediately. You start small. You practice noticing sensations in the body. Where is there tightness? Where is there ease? You practice naming small emotions. Not I feel devastated, but I feel slightly uncomfortable. Not I feel ecstatic, but I notice a small sense of pleasantness. This is where somatic therapies become crucial, because emotional numbness lives in the body as much as the mind. Approaches like somatic experiencing, EMDR, or sensory-motor psychotherapy work directly with the nervous system to complete the stress responses that got frozen mid-cycle. Remember, trauma and overwhelm happen because the nervous system gets stuck in activation or shutdown. Thawing means allowing the system to complete its natural cycle, to discharge the energy that's been trapped, to process what couldn't be processed, to finally finish the story that got interrupted. One woman described her first therapy session where she accessed frozen emotion. I was talking about something from childhood, nothing I hadn't talked about before. But the therapist asked me to notice what I was feeling in my body, and suddenly I realized my chest was incredibly tight. She had me breathe into it, and then, without any conscious choice, I started sobbing. Deep, wrenching sobs. I hadn't cried in years. I thought I couldn't cry, but the tears had been there all along, just trapped. It was terrifying and relieving at the same time. This is thawing, and it's uncomfortable, because the emotions don't return gently. They often come in waves, in floods, in storms. The nervous system is recalibrating. Learning to feel again after years of not feeling is like turning on a light after being in darkness. It's overwhelming at first. The second stage is what therapists call integration. Having access to emotions is one thing. Being able to integrate them into a coherent sense of self is another. Remember Carl Jung's insight. Emotional numbness represented a split between conscious and unconscious, between different parts of the psyche. Awakening means healing that split, bringing the exiled parts back home. This is where internal family systems therapy offers a powerful framework. The theory suggests that our psyche is not a single unified self, but a system of parts. There are parts that hold joy, parts that hold rage, parts that hold shame, parts that hold vulnerability. In emotional numbness, some parts have been exiled, locked away because their emotions were too dangerous. Other parts have taken over management, the parts that suppress, that control, that keep you functional, even if it means killing aliveness. Integration means allowing the exiled parts to speak, to be heard, to be welcomed back into the system. It means negotiating between the parts that want to feel and the parts that are terrified of feeling. It means building internal trust, trusting that you can handle emotions without being destroyed by them. One technique involves literally dialoguing with different parts of yourself, asking the numb part, "What are you protecting me from?" Asking the grieving part, "What do you need?" Asking the angry part, "What boundary was violated?" This might sound strange if you've never done it, but it works. Because these parts are real. They represent real patterns of neural activity, real memories, real survival strategies that got encoded in your system. Integration means becoming a democracy instead of a dictatorship. No single part gets to rule. All parts get representation. And the authentic self, the core you, emerges from the negotiation between them. The third stage is reconnection. Emotional numbness creates isolation not just from self, but from others. Awakening means rebuilding the capacity for genuine connection. This is harder than it sounds, because connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is precisely what the numbness was designed to prevent. Brené Brown defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. When you've been numb, all three of these feel like death. Uncertainty means losing control. Risk means possible pain. Emotional exposure means being seen in your rawness, but connection cannot exist without vulnerability. You cannot have authentic relationships while still wearing the armor of numbness. You must be willing to be seen, to be known, to share your internal experience even when it's messy, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're not sure how it will be received. This requires finding the right people, people who can hold space for your emerging emotional life without judgment or overwhelm. This might be a therapist, a support group, a trusted friend, a partner who is willing to be patient through the awkward process of you learning to feel again. One man described his experience. "I told my girlfriend that I'd been emotionally numb for years and was just starting to feel again. I warned her it might be weird, that I might cry suddenly, or not respond the way I used to, or need space to process things. Instead of being scared away, she said, 'Thank you for telling me. I'm here for whatever comes.' That permission, that acceptance, was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me." Reconnection also means grieving what was lost during the numb years, the relationships that deteriorated, the experiences that happened but weren't felt, the versions of yourself that died in the grey lands. This grief is real and legitimate. You mourn not just what happened, but what didn't happen, the life you could have lived if you'd been fully present for it. But on the other side of that grief is something unexpected. Gratitude. Gratitude that you survived. Gratitude that you're feeling again. Gratitude that it's not too late. The fourth stage, and this may be the most important, is meaning-making. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. The question is not, why did this happen? But what does this mean for who I become? Emotional numbness, and the awakening from it, becomes part of your story. Not the whole story, not the defining story, but a chapter that shapes the narrative. Some people find meaning by becoming helpers. They become therapists, support group leaders, advocates for mental health awareness. They take their pain and transform it into service. Others find meaning by committing to presence. They decide that because they lost years to numbness, they will live the remaining years with radical attentiveness to feeling, to beauty, to connection. Still others find meaning in creativity. They make art about the experience. They write, they paint, they compose. They transform emotional experience into aesthetic experience that others can witness and recognize. There is no single right way to make meaning. The point is that the suffering becomes material for growth rather than just a random catastrophe that happened to you. You take what happened and build something from it. This is what Jung called individuation. This is what the existentialists called authenticity. This is what spiritual traditions call enlightenment or awakening, not as an escape from difficulty, but as a transformation of your relationship to it. But let's be honest about something important. The awakening is not a permanent state. You do not arrive at emotional fluency and stay there forever, fixed and unchangeable. Emotional life is dynamic. There will be times when numbness returns, maybe not to the same depth, but as a visitor. During periods of high stress, during new traumas, during overwhelming times, some degree of emotional shutdown may recur. This is not failure. This is not proof that you haven't healed. This is the nervous system doing what it was designed to do, protect you. The difference is that now you recognize it. You have tools, you have awareness, you know the territory. You can say, oh, I'm starting to feel numb again. That's my system telling me I'm overwhelmed. What do I need? Instead of being lost in it, you can work with it. This is emotional literacy. The ability to read your own emotional landscape accurately and respond with wisdom rather than fear. And here's what many people discover. The sensitivity that returns after numbness is extraordinary. Having lost access to feeling and then regained it, you appreciate it differently. Colors seem brighter, music penetrates deeper, love feels more precious, joy, even small joys, become profound. One woman said, I can cry now. I cried watching a sunset last week, not because I was sad, just because it was beautiful and I could feel the beauty. That would have seemed insane to me 5 years ago. Now it's everything. Let me tell you about a concept from neuroscience that gives hope to this entire process: neuroplasticity. Remember how emotional numbness can physically change the brain? How the neural pathways between emotion centers and conscious awareness can atrophy with disuse? The revolutionary discovery of the past few decades is that the brain can change in the opposite direction too. New neural pathways can be built, atrophied connections can be strengthened. The brain can rewire itself toward feeling. But here's the crucial part. It requires practice, repetition, patience. Every time you practice noticing a sensation in your body, you're strengthening neural pathways. Every time you name an emotion, you're building connections. Every time you allow yourself to feel something, even something small, you're literally rewiring your brain. It's like rebuilding a muscle after atrophy. At first it's weak. The movement is difficult, clumsy, exhausting. But with consistent practice, the muscle strengthens. Neural pathways are no different. This means recovery from emotional numbness is not mystical or magical. It's biological. It follows the same principles as learning any new skill. Consistent practice, gradual progression, patience with the process. Studies of trauma survivors who've recovered emotional access show measurable changes in brain activity. The prefrontal cortex reconnects with the limbic system. The amygdala becomes less hyperactive. The hippocampus better integrates traumatic memories. The nervous system learns to regulate itself more effectively. Healing is real. Change is possible. The brain is not fixed. You are not doomed to permanent numbness just because you've experienced it. And now we come to something that might seem contradictory, but is actually essential: the wisdom that numbness taught you. Because here's the truth: emotional numbness, while painful, is also brilliant. It is your system's most sophisticated survival mechanism. It kept you alive. It allowed you to function when functioning was necessary. It protected you from being overwhelmed and destroyed. The goal is not to demonize the numbness. The goal is to thank it for its service and then choose something else now that you have more resources. Some degree of emotional regulation, the ability to modulate intensity, to create distance when needed, to not be completely overwhelmed by every feeling, is actually healthy and necessary. The Stoics were right about something. Not every emotion needs to be indulged or followed. Not every feeling needs to run your life. There is wisdom in being able to step back, observe emotions without drowning in them, choose how to respond rather than simply react. The difference is choice. Healthy emotional regulation is voluntary. You choose when to engage deeply with emotion and when to create space. You're driving the car. Emotional numbness is involuntary. You're not choosing not to feel. You've lost the ability to feel. You're a passenger in a car with no driver. Recovery means regaining agency. You develop the capacity to feel deeply when appropriate and regulate when necessary. You become flexible, responsive, adaptive. This is emotional mastery, not suppression, not constant overwhelm, but fluid movement between states according to what the situation requires. Let me share one final insight about awakening from emotional numbness, and it comes from an unexpected source: quantum physics. Physicist Niels Bohr said, "The opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth." Here's the profound truth: you must feel everything to be fully alive. And here's its opposite, equally true: you cannot feel everything without being destroyed. The awakening is learning to hold both truths simultaneously, to develop the capacity to feel deeply while also developing the wisdom to protect yourself, to be open without being naive, to be sensitive without being fragile, to be emotionally alive without being emotionally overwhelmed. This is the middle way that Buddhist philosophy talks about. This is the dialectical synthesis that Hegel described. This is the integration of opposites that Jung considered the goal of individuation. You become someone who can feel intensely, but not indefinitely. Someone who can dive deep, but also resurface. Someone who can be emotionally present without being emotionally destroyed. This is mature emotional life. This is what lies on the other side of the awakening. And so the journey comes full circle. You descended into the grey lands. You learned why you went numb. You faced what the numbness was protecting you from. You practiced feeling again. You reconnected with yourself and others. You made meaning from the suffering. You are no longer the person who entered the void, but you are also not someone who has forgotten what the void taught you. You are someone who has died and resurrected, someone who has been to the underworld and returned, someone who knows both the necessity of numbness and the preciousness of feeling. You are, in the deepest sense, awake. We stand now at a strange moment in human history. Technology advances exponentially. AI systems are learning to recognize and generate emotional expression. Virtual reality creates immersive emotional experiences. Neuroscience develops new tools to map and potentially modify emotional circuitry. Pharmaceutical companies design molecules to regulate mood with increasing precision. The question hovering over all of this is profound. What is the future of human emotion? Will we enhance our emotional capacity? building brains that can feel more deeply, more broadly, with greater range and sophistication? Or will we engineer numbness by choice, designing systems that protect us from emotional pain while preserving function? Some transhumanists dream of a future where suffering is optional, where you could dial down fear, anger, sadness with the precision of a thermostat, where emotional pain becomes an artifact of our primitive past, like appendices and wisdom teeth, unnecessary remnants of evolution that we've outgrown. But this vision misunderstands something fundamental. Emotions are not bugs in the human operating system. They are features. They are information. They are the language the body uses to communicate with consciousness. They are how we know what matters to us. Remove emotional pain, and you remove the signal that something is wrong. Remove fear, and you remove the motivation to protect yourself. Remove sadness, and you remove the capacity to appreciate joy. Remove anger, and you remove the ability to defend boundaries. The goal is not to eliminate emotion. The goal is to develop wisdom about emotion, to understand it, to work with it, to integrate it into a life of meaning and purpose. Emotional numbness taught us something crucial, that disconnection from feeling is not freedom. It is a kind of death in life, a hollowing out of what makes us human. But it also taught us that pure, unregulated emotion is not wisdom either, that being completely at the mercy of every feeling that arises is its own form of suffering. The future of human consciousness, both individually and collectively, depends on developing what we might call emotional intelligence at a species level, not just understanding emotions intellectually, but embodying a mature relationship with emotional life. This means teaching children emotional literacy from the beginning, not teaching them to suppress or indulge, but to recognize, name, process, and integrate. This means building cultures that honor emotional experience rather than commodifying or pathologizing it. This means creating technologies that enhance rather than replace genuine human connection. This means understanding that the solution to emotional overwhelm is not more numbness, but more capacity. Let me end with this. You, the person listening to these words right now, whether you are in the grey lands currently, whether you have been and returned, whether you have never been but recognize this territory in someone you love, you are part of the most important work being done on this planet, the work of becoming fully human, the work of feeling deeply in a world that profits from numbness, the work of staying present in a culture designed to distract, the work of integration in a civilization that specializes in fragmentation. Every time you choose to feel something real instead of scrolling past it, you are doing the work. Every time you sit with discomfort instead of immediately numbing it, you are doing the work. Every time you connect authentically instead of performing connection, you are doing the work. This is not small. This is not insignificant. This is the difference between surviving and living, between existing and experiencing, between going through life and being alive in it. The room with no windows, the place of emotional numbness, will always exist in the architecture of human consciousness. It serves a purpose. It has wisdom. It saves lives. But you do not have to live there permanently. You can visit when necessary. You can honor its protection. And then you can leave. You can walk back out into the world of feeling, into the painful, beautiful, overwhelming, extraordinary experience of being fully human. The ancient Egyptians believed that when you died, your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If your heart was too heavy with wrongdoing, you could not enter the afterlife. But there was another danger they spoke of less often. What if your heart was too light? What if it weighed nothing at all? A heart that weighs nothing is a heart that has never loved, never grieved, never felt the full weight of being alive. A heart that weighs nothing is a heart that has traded feeling for safety. A heart that weighs nothing passes through the world leaving no impression, no mark, no evidence of having been here at all. Your heart is meant to have weight, the weight of joy, the weight of sorrow, the weight of love and loss and everything between. This weight is not burden, it is substance. It is proof that you were here, that you felt, that you lived. So feel. Feel even when it's difficult. Feel especially when it's difficult. Feel because numbness is safe, but feeling is alive. Feel because you owe it to the years you spent not feeling. Feel because it's the most human thing you can do. Feel because somewhere, in a room with no windows, a version of yourself is waiting to be rescued, and the only person who can rescue them is you. The journey back to feeling is the hero's journey, and you are the hero. Welcome back to the land of the living.